Well, the new Conjuring movie is hitting theaters this weekend, or maybe last weekend, depends on when I get this video posted. As I film this, it's coming out this coming weekend. I haven't seen it yet, so I won't be reviewing The Conjuring Last Rites here. That'll be coming in another video in the very near future once I just get a chance to see it. Instead, what I'm doing here is taking a look back at The Conjuring and Annabelle and the Amityville Horror and all the various cases Ed and Lorraine Warren investigated over the years. This might be a controversial one, but as a horror fan and as a paranormal investigator myself, I think it's time we got to the bottom of The Conjuring and the Warrens. Ed and Lorraine Warren are, or I guess I should say were, undoubtedly the most famous paranormal investigators and or demonologists in the world. Their cases have inspired countless books and films, ranging from The Conjuring to Annabelle to the Amityville Horror. Though people have always been interested in ghosts and demons, we can probably credit much of the current media sensation around paranormal investigations, not to mention a sizable portion of the horror genre itself, directly to the Warrens' work. Now, I'm a paranormal investigator myself. I've been with the Rocky Mountain Paranormal Research Society for years now. The third book of our own paranormal case files is, as of this filming, coming very soon. Combine that background with my obsession with the horror genre, and you just know I'm going to have some thoughts about the Warrens and about the books and films their work inspired. So, with the new movie coming out, I thought it was long past time I should share some of those thoughts publicly here on this channel. So, just who were these maestros of the macabre, these professors of the paranormal? Honestly, like most paranormal investigators, they didn't have any particular background in the subject. That's not a point against them. It's pretty much impossible to have a professional background in such an ill-defined and unproven field as the paranormal. Same goes for my own work. The question really comes down to the quality of the work itself. But before we get to the cases, and we will get to their cases, we should meet the individuals involved. Just who were these people who claimed to have investigated more than 10,000 paranormal occurrences? Ed Warren was born on September the 7th, 1926 in Bridgeport, Connecticut. After being discharged from the United States Navy after World War II, he made his living as an itinerant house and sign painter, though I think he was really more interested in artistic paintings. But he never really found too much success on that front. Lorraine Warren, on the other hand, was born Lorraine Morin on January 31st, 1927, also in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and educated at a prestigious Catholic girls' school called Laurelton Hall. She met Ed when they were both in their teens, and he was working as a movie theater usher. Later in life, she would claim that she immediately knew, thanks to her psychic intuition, that he was the one she'd marry. And marry they did on May 22nd, 1945. There's not much more to say biographically until we get to the paranormal claims themselves, but just to finish off the more mundane elements of their lives before we get to the interesting stuff, they had one daughter and 4 grandchildren. Ed Warren passed away on August 23rd, 2006, and Lorraine died on April 18th, 2019. Getting into the more paranormal of it all, they founded the New England Society for Psychic Research in 1952, which pretty much began their long career as paranormal investigators. But the event that would really catapult them to international fame didn't occur until they became involved in the Amityville Horror case in 1975. But though it was the first case of theirs to attract so much media attention and to inspire so many horror books and movies, it wasn't the first case they worked. In subsequent years, even some of their earlier cases have become at least as famous as Amityville. So let's turn our attention to those cases now. We'll talk about Annabelle, all of the Conjuring movies, and Amityville in due course. I've decided to present the cases in as close to chronological order as I can figure out, which means we'll be jumping back and forth between the different franchises a little bit, and we'll learn about the Warrens and their work along the way. But before I dive in with the stories, let me just say a couple things about the books and movies in general terms. I have nothing against any of these horror stories. Amityville is a true classic of the genre. The Conjuring movies are now a multi-billion-dollar, that's Carl Sagan billion with a B, they're a multi-billion-dollar franchise for very good reason. They're great horror movies. So I am not criticizing the films or the books they're based on in this video. Not at all. I'm only trying to set the record straight about what the true stories really were. That's probably going to be controversial, and I'm probably going to get some comments from y'all because so many people love those films so much they've become invested in them being completely true. People have become attached to the Warrens as they're depicted on screen, and it might be uncomfortable to hear about who and what the Warrens really were. I get that, but the truth is the most important part. Saying that, I think you probably already can guess that I'm skeptical of at least some of the claims, and that's true. But it's also important to note that I'm not saying there's no such thing as ghosts or demons. That's not for me to say. Even in my own books, though we did indeed debunk some of the claims we've investigated, we have also happened across some genuinely creepy things that we can't explain, or at least that we can't explain yet. So maybe the world really is full of ghosts. Maybe there's demons around every corner. Could be. But when it comes to these cases in particular, the truth is often pretty far from what you see in the movies or read in the books. The last thing I need to mention is that not all of the movies in the Conjuring franchise were based on the Warrens' stories. I have them here. I'm going to sort through some of them. So this is a collection of a bunch of the movies. I'll just set that to the side. Annabelle was one of their stories. That's right here. And all of the ones called The Conjuring, that's The Conjuring, The Conjuring 2, and The Conjuring 3, The Devil Made Me Do It, those were based on the Warrens' cases. But the Annabelle prequel and sequel, and the Nun movies, The Nun and The Nun 2, were entirely fictional stories based on the mythology established in the ones that were more directly based on the Warrens' cases. So for this video, we'll only focus on the real cases that involved the Warrens directly. Let's start with Annabelle. I don't know the exact year in which the doll's owner gave it to the Warrens, but it was sometime in the early 1970s. I saw one report that might have said 1968, sometime around there for sure. And we can therefore consider this the first of the major Warren cases chronologically. I'm not going to provide a complete synopsis of the entire plot or the entire case here, and that's going to be the same for the rest of these as well. If you want to hear the Warrens' version of the story, read their books or watch the movie, and that's pretty much the case as they described it. The films took certain liberties, but pretty close. But just to set the stage, I'll tell you a little bit. The story involves a nursing student who was given a Raggedy Ann doll, which soon started to move by itself. A medium said it contained the spirit of a woman named Annabelle. Later developments suggested it wasn't just an ordinary spirit, but that the doll was possessed by a demon. According to the lore, people who've mocked the doll have even been killed by its power. It was given to the Warrens and has ever since been housed in their occult museum, which is now in the hands of comedian Matt Rife, of all people, where it and their other artifacts are sometimes studied by a variety of paranormal investigators. Because the truth is often stranger than fiction, just earlier this year, Annabelle went on tour. This initially prompted claims that the doll had mysteriously vanished, but she'd actually just been taken out for the publicity tour. During that tour, though, Dan Rivera, who had been leading the tour, died in Pennsylvania, prompting a ton of online speculation that he'd been somehow killed by Annabelle, though police, for whatever it's worth, found nothing suspicious about his death.
And here I have to break in with another new update that just hit the newspapers while I was editing this video after I had filmed it. The update is that the coroner has now announced Rivera's cause of death. Apparently he passed away due to cardiac arrest, natural causes. Apparently he had a known cardiac issue in the past. And the Annabelle doll was not present in the room when he died. So that is the update as of editing this video, and then we'll get back to our original discussion now.
As of this filming, Annabelle is still out on tour. The full story of Annabelle, at least the Warrens' version of the story, is told in the 1980 book The Demonologists by Gerald Brittle, part of the Warrens' Case Files series, and of course in the now famous horror movie called Annabelle. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that I mentioned Annabelle is actually a Raggedy Ann doll. That's true. The filmmakers created a decidedly creepy and now iconic doll for their movies, which was probably a good idea and also maybe necessary for trademark reasons. But the real one was and is just an ordinary Raggedy Ann that got a very extraordinary story attached to it. And incidentally, this is not the only common property or common sort of a doll that can sometimes get a paranormal story attached to it. With Rocky Mountain Paranormal, we have recently heard of a case that we may or may not get the opportunity to investigate. They haven't reached back out to us, but they have suggested, I'm not going to say which kind of a doll it was, but it's even funnier than a Raggedy Ann. I'm just going to leave it at that. Perhaps part of the reason Annabelle is considered the flagship of the Warrens' cases is simply because a lot of people find dolls inherently creepy, or maybe it's because it's difficult to directly debunk the story. Indeed, there is no real smoking gun here to suggest the tale is provably false, but there are some reasons to be suspicious. First of all, Annabelle has been examined by plenty of skeptics and believers alike over the years, and no one, believer, skeptic, no one has ever been able to document any supernatural manifestations. Psychics have claimed they felt a malevolent being in Annabelle's presence, but psychics themselves are unproven, so we can't use them to prove another case. But in terms of somebody actually testing the paranormal claims scientifically or reliably, or video recording the doll moving, or anything like that, anything verifiable, we have bupkis. That doesn't disprove it, but we can't take a lack of evidence as the proof we're looking for. There's also some reason to think the story might have been made up or embellished by the Warrens. The idea of haunted dolls, of course, predates Annabelle. There's another famous one called Robert the Doll, whose paranormal legend goes all the way back to in or around 1904, when the doll's owner, Robert Eugene Otto, blamed the doll for mishaps and misbehavior around the house. It's another famous case, though it never quite got the reputation Annabelle did, so it's entirely possible, even likely, that the Warrens would have known about the lore and perhaps been on the lookout for similar cases of their own. Others have noted that the Annabelle story seems to be an almost direct retelling of the 1963 Twilight Zone episode called Living Doll. The mother's name in that episode was even Annabelle. And the similarities between the stories, The Living Doll and Annabelle, are striking. Some have gone as far as to claim Annabelle is a beat-by-beat retelling of Living Doll. That overstates the case, and I'd argue that the fastest way to lose an argument is indeed to overstate it. There are noteworthy differences between the stories, but given the similarities, and that the name Annabelle shows up in both, we can't entirely discount the potential connection either. So, what should we think about it? Well, color me skeptical. Knowing what I know about the Warrens from the other cases I'm about to discuss, I think I have reason to doubt the Annabelle story. That said, it might actually be, on some level, one of the most plausible of all the stories, in that there is no direct evidence against its truthfulness. There's no smoking gun. There's no provable hoax or anything like that. I, for one, would love to conduct a full and proper investigation into Annabelle, along with the Rocky Mountain Paranormal Research Society. Since Matt Rife is now the legal guardian of the doll and the other haunted artifacts, if anyone watching this happens to know how to get in touch with him or his people, drop me a line. That brings us to the second of what I'd consider the three big cases the Warrens worked on, the Conjuring itself. In this case, the Perrin family moved into a farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island, and soon started experiencing terrifying and sometimes violent paranormal activity. They contacted the Warrens, who began to investigate. Lorraine Warren, who claimed to be a psychic or a clairvoyant, said the house was haunted by an evil entity, and subsequent research led them to discover it was once the home of an accused witch and a Satanist named Bathsheba Sherman, who sacrificed her own child to the devil and then hanged herself on the property, but not before setting a sort of curse over the entire estate. This is the first of our cases in which it becomes relevant that Lorraine claimed psychic ability. I asked Brian Bonner, my co-author on the Rocky Mountain Paranormal books, about Lorraine. I knew all about Ed's background, and we'll get to that in a moment, but I also knew that Brian had met Lorraine. He had met her personally and knew her to a certain extent, and I was curious if he thought she actually believed that she was psychic, or if she was just acting and playing that part for publicity purposes. It's probably impossible to ever know for certain, but Brian said he figured it was Ed who convinced Lorraine she was psychic, and she started to increasingly believe it herself as the years went on and their own mythology grew. For what it's worth, he even told her to her face that she could be his grandmother anytime she wanted, but she should never be his ghost hunter. As for why he thinks Ed might have been more nefariously involved or manipulatively involved in convincing her she was clairvoyant, well, we'll get to that part shortly. But getting back to The Conjuring, this is, of course, another case in which there's no real good evidence. In fact, the couple who owned the home when the movie came out, not the people the case was about, but the people who owned the property when the movie came out, they said nothing had ever happened there during their ownership of the property. Maybe something could have happened in the past, but they never saw any of it. They would even go on to sue James Wan, the director, and Warner Brothers, claiming the movie had caused horror fans to descend en masse upon their home and to vandalize their property, though that case was dismissed in 2017. But, though their lawsuit was unsuccessful, they claimed the house had been peaceful from the time of their purchase in 1987, right up until the movie came out. No ghosts, no demons, peaceful and not particularly noteworthy. But maybe the Warrens or somebody else just made the evil spirits go away. Maybe they could have really been there in the past and the problem just got solved. Anything's possible, I suppose. And for their part, the Perrin family did continue to maintain their story was true. However, if one digs into the history, one finds some problems. Bathsheba Sherman, the supposed witch, was indeed a real person who lived in the area. Unfortunately for the story, she was never accused of witchcraft or anything of the sort. She certainly never sacrificed her child, never killed herself, and never even owned the house in question. She was just a perfectly innocent person whose name got dragged through the mud because it made for a good ghost story. To me, that's the really disgusting part of the story, and that's why I end up having something of a love-hate relationship with The Conjuring. On the one hand, it genuinely is one of the best horror movies of recent decades. Honest to God. But on the other hand, it perpetuates a false allegation against an innocent woman who isn't around to defend herself anymore, and that's frankly kind of sickening. There's also an interesting side note in terms of how the Warrens got involved in the case. Though the film, if I remember correctly, depicts them as being specifically called in by the homeowners, that's really not the case. The Perron family did claim paranormal manifestations, but the Warrens just showed up uninvited to take on the case, which they subsequently turned into one of their famous stories, and now into a multi-billion-dollar film franchise. Say what you will about the Warrens, and I'm going to have some more to say, but they knew how to find the cases that would get famous. That brings us to what may be the most famous one of all, Amityville, the Amityville Horror. I think we all know the story. This is a horror channel. If you're watching me, you probably know the Amityville Horror, but just to sum it up briefly, the story begins on November 13th, 1974, when Ronald DeFeo Jr., also known as Butch, shot and killed 6 members of his own family in the now infamous house at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville. About a year later, in December of 1975, the Lutz family moved into the same house. As the story goes, they quickly started experiencing all manner of paranormal activity, which ultimately caused them to flee the house. It's one of the most famous horror stories ever, having inspired the Amityville Horror, the book by Jay Anson, as you see here, and the film adaptation of the same title, as well as dozens upon dozens of other films, including such modern classics as Amityville Shark House, Amityville Bigfoot, and Amityville Backpack. Just to prove my point, I have here in my possession the Amityville Murders and Amityville Clown House. So clearly the filmmakers aren't taking the story very seriously anymore, but the original Amityville Horror, this book and the Amityville Horror, the first movie, was serious business indeed. Just as an interesting side note, the house itself looked like it ought to be haunted, with those windows looking like evil eyes peering down on anyone who might be passing by. That house became so iconic that though most of the house maintains its original appearance and its original structure, subsequent owners have had those windows replaced just to make it look a little less frightening or perhaps a little less recognizable to tourists. Which is how I came to have some little pieces of those original haunted-looking window frames in my own collection, and here they are right here. I took them down just to film this video. These are little pieces of those original window frames, sadly, which are no longer in the house, but I'm happy to have them here in my collection. I'm also a little bit jealous of my aforementioned co-author because he actually has in his collection a shelf ornament which was in the house on the night of the DeFeo murders. For whatever it's worth, a self-professed psychic sensitive of some sort who saw that piece claimed to feel some kind of paranormal energy from it, though personally I don't know how to distinguish that kind of a feeling from simple heebie-jeebies from knowing the item's history. But that's neither here nor there. That would be something we would have to test, and we have not yet done so, although we're still doing a lot of investigating, so that could end up being a case file sometime in the future. Again, neither here nor there. So, does the story hold up, the original story of the Amityville Horror? Well, parts of it are undoubtedly true. The DeFeo murders really did take place pretty much as described, or at least maybe kind of sort of mostly as described. One of the things I've heard people suggest is that there must have been something paranormal going on, not only to possess DeFeo to murder his own family in their sleep in the first place, but to actually keep all 6 of them, all 6 of the victims, asleep and unaware as all these gunshots were going off throughout the house. That does sound like quite an unbelievable part of the story, I have to admit. A more recent documentary, which is even available right here on YouTube, is called Shattered Hopes, the true story of the Amityville murders. It's an exhaustive 3-part documentary, which barely even touches on the paranormal story, actually, but is what I consider to be one of the best sources of information on the murders themselves. And it raises some interesting questions about whether DeFeo's sister might also have been involved in the murders. I needn't and I won't go into all of the details here, but I found the argument somewhat convincing, even if it is admittedly speculative, and I would recommend checking out that documentary. But for what we need to know now, the murder part of the story is at least essentially true. What about the paranormal claims, though? Well, they've been knocked down one by one. One of the key parts of the story is that Father Pecoraro, whose name was changed in the Amityville Horror, but his real name was Father Pecoraro, upon blessing the house, he experienced some paranormal events of his own. Conflicting reports have emerged about his involvement, though. During a 1979 television interview, he reiterated the basics of the claim as told in the horror story. However, in sworn testimony given during a lawsuit in the late 1970s, he said that he never even went to the house. He only spoke to the Lutzes over the telephone, and the entire thing had been a fabrication. Admittedly, these stories are contradictory, and I can't think of any way of unifying them, but personally, I give greater weight to the sworn statement for whatever that's worth. One of the claims about his experiences is that when he was driving away from the house, the hood of his car flipped open and impeded his view. In their book, The Amityville Horror Conspiracy, paranormal investigators Stephen and Roxanne Kaplan pointed out that this was impossible in the kind of car that he drove because the hood opened in the other direction, and it couldn't have flipped up and impeded his view at all. Another claim was that the Lutzes saw cloven-hooved footprints in the snow on January 1st, 1979, suggesting demonic activity. Trouble there was that there was no snowfall on that day or any day around that time, so this, again, was impossible. Maybe they just got the date wrong. That could be, but given everything else, given all the other holes in the story, I don't think so. For what it's worth, the people who lived in the house after the Lutzes moved out said all the damage the house supposedly suffered because of the paranormal terror never occurred. Everything that was supposed to have been broken by the end of the Amityville Horror was intact when they moved in, nor did they experience anything unusual for themselves while living in the house. As for whether the Lutzes have maintained their story or not, some have and some haven't. Father George Lutz, the main character, maintained for the rest of his life that the story was mostly true, but the children have given divergent accounts in subsequent years, some claiming everything was true and some saying not so much. The most telling account was given by none other than William Weber, DeFeo's own defense attorney in the murder trial. He contacted the Lutzes because he thought their interests converged. He was working on an insanity defense in the trial and also trying to negotiate a book deal. The Lutzes had bought more house than they could afford and needed the money a book deal could provide. As Weber described it, the entire horror story was cooked up between himself and the Lutzes over, in his phrase, many bottles of wine. They then cut him out of the book deal he was working on by negotiating their own book deal with Jay Anson, resulting in the Amityville Horror, in which they would receive a bigger cut of the profits. The Warrens' own involvement was brief. They were among several paranormal investigators called to the house to look into the matter, and while they were there, a now famous photograph was captured which was purported to show the image of a ghostly boy with glowing eyes in the house. However, it was quickly determined to just be Paul Bartz, another of the investigators, whose eyes appeared to glow simply because the light reflected off his glasses. But though the Warrens didn't investigate for very long, they did help to make the story famous because their name added some clout to it all. And though they weren't the ones to negotiate this book and movie deal, The pattern the Lutzes followed closely mirrors how the Warrens liked to publicize all of their most interesting cases. The next case actually took place in England and centered on poltergeist activity surrounding these two young sisters aged, I believe, 11 and 13 years, named Janet and Margaret Hodgson. Apparently, when their family moved into their new home in Enfield, a bunch of poltergeist activity started happening. Furniture would move, spoons would bend, and Janet was even photographed levitating above her bed. Remarkable stuff. She would sometimes speak in voices as if possessed by a spirit. That case, though, has been widely debunked. The photo showing her levitating off her bed, for example, really just shows her jumping off her bed. Other investigators caught the girls on hidden camera bending spoons manually, moving furniture about, and producing the knocking sounds by hitting the ceiling with a broom handle. Some have even said the girls admitted the whole thing was a hoax. That is only partially true. When they got caught, and they did get caught, they admitted to hoaxing some of the phenomena, on the order, they said, of about 2%. But they never quite disavowed the entire story. Personally, I think when you get caught hoaxing 2% of the story, you probably hoaxed the whole thing, but I guess I'm just skeptical that way. If that sounds really nothing like The Conjuring 2, you're not really wrong. It was a much more ordinary kind of a haunting story that got severely exaggerated into this horror movie. Fair enough. But where did the Warrens come into it in the first place? Well, when they heard about all the paranormal investigations going on looking into the story, they once again showed up uninvited and looked around the house for a couple hours. That was the extent of their investigation and their involvement in the case. They then tried to convince Guy Playfair, the investigator much more directly involved in the case, that a lot of money could be made by selling the story for books or, indeed, for movies. When he wasn't interested, they just sold the story for themselves. They might not have been very good paranormal investigators, especially in this case, but they really had a great eye for recognizing stories they could turn into profitable sales. The next story, chronologically, was the case of Arnie Cheyenne Johnson, which became The Conjuring 3, The Devil Made Me Do It. I even wrote about this briefly in my own case files of the Rocky Mountain Paranormal Research Society, Volume 3, coming soon. And though I didn't go into the case in great detail, it came up while I was discussing demonic possession as a legal defense against criminal charges, because that's exactly what happened in this case. The way the story goes, it began with a demonic possession, not of Arnie himself, but of his brother David Johnson. The Warrens were called in to assist, and while attempting an exorcism, Arnie convinced the demon to possess him instead, sort of like the end of The Exorcist in many ways. Thus possessed, he would later go on to murder his landlord, and then attempt to use his demonic possession as his legal defense at trial. The real story, at least as maintained by the Warrens and the Believers, largely follows the plot of the movie, except the movie introduces a middle section to the story to do with a cult called the Disciples of the Ram, which isn't part of the real story, but is part of the sort of mythology that the Conjuring filmmakers have been building. So, what's the real story? Well, this is one in which the Warrens really did seem to play a large role. It's not like the other one where they showed up for just a couple hours. They were really involved in this case. And as far as I've been able to determine, the exorcisms, several of them actually, really did take place. And Johnson did try to use demonic possession as a defense at trial, though the judge completely barred that line of evidence as soon as his team tried to bring it up. Netflix made a documentary called The Devil on Trial, which does a better job of sticking to the true facts and allegations of the case rather than the fictionalized Conjuring version, but a lot of the broad strokes really are the same. But is it true? Well, as is often the case, there's no evidence for any of the more outlandish claims. It's claimed, for example, that David levitated during the exorcism. There's no video of it. There's no evidence for it. So a lot of it really comes down to who you want to believe. But For what it's worth, Arnie and David's older brother Carl said that the whole demonic possession thing was false, and that his brother just suffered hallucinations and delusions. In 2007, David and Carl Glatzel sued Lorraine Warren, Ed had died by then, and author Gerald Brittle over claims they'd made about the case. The lawsuit was dismissed, but Brittle took the book out of print as a result. The next case in our chronological list is the Snedeker case, which inspired the book In a Dark Place and the movie A Haunting in Connecticut. And by the way, speaking of all these books and movies we're discussing, I've conveniently put purchase links to all of them for you right down there in the What's It, so you can get copies for yourself. And if you use my link down there, you're doing a ton to support my work here, which is very much appreciated. I also appreciate the thumbs up if you're interested in this video, if you like what I'm doing. I appreciate any comments you might leave me, and of course, if you subscribe, ring that notification bell, share this video with your friends, family, acquaintances, enemies, I don't know, whoever you might want to share it with. It's all very much appreciated, and you have my thanks in advance. But for now, we need to talk about the Snedeker case, and this is one about which I have some greater degree of insight, because I was personally acquainted with one of the major players in the story. The way the story is told, the Snedeker family rented this giant home at a bargain basement price when they decided that they needed to move in order to be closer to the clinic where their son Philip was to receive cancer treatments. But they quickly started experiencing, as usual, paranormal phenomena focused specifically in the basement of their new home. Soon, Philip started to claim that the devil wanted him to do terrible things. Why such evil in this particular house? Well, it used to be a funeral parlor, and apparently the people who ran it got into some horrible things of their own. According to Lorraine Warren's psychic visions during their investigation into the case, the owners of the funeral home were engaged in a variety of practices, including seances, necromancy, and even necrophilia. What's the truth about this one? Well, as you may have noticed by now, the Warrens never wrote their own books. They sold their stories to authors for a share of royalties, or more often, hired authors to write their stories for them. This wasn't exactly ghostwriting because the authors were named on the covers of the books, but it's sort of the next closest thing to ghostwriting. Anyway, as it happens, the author hired to write the Snedeker story was a good friend of mine, the late great horror author Ray Garton. And by the way, if you've never read any of his work before, you really need to. Great author. Anyway, the book he wrote about this case was called In a Dark Place, and I heard some things from Ray directly, which he's also mentioned in public, so I'm not betraying any great confidences here, and he managed to shed some light on the case in particular and how the Warrens operated in general. The first thing he noted was that the Snedekers were giving him contradictory information when he spoke to them to try to get notes for his book. I'll quote him directly. The family involved, which was going through some serious problems like alcoholism and drug addiction, could not keep their story straight, and I became very frustrated. It's hard writing a nonfiction book when all the people involved are telling you different stories. Now, he'd been hired directly by the Warrens to write the book, so being so frustrated, he went to Ed Warren for advice about what to do about all of the contradictory stories he was getting, and he also records Ed's reply to him, and again, I'm quoting here in Ray's own words. He said, "When I went to Ed, he said, use what you can and make the rest up. You write scary books, right? That's why we hired you. So just use what you can, make the rest up, and make it scary." In other words, behind closed doors, Ed Warren himself all but admitted the story was fake, and fully admitted that he didn't care about the truth as long as it would make a good and profitable horror story. On some level, that's fair enough. I love a scary story too, but I never try to pass off my fiction as fact. And that's sort of what I've been saying. These are really great horror stories. Ray's novel, and I will call it a novel rather than a nonfiction book, despite what it might say on the back cover, is a truly brilliant book. It's a great scary story, but it's the product of an author's imagination. It's not reality. But it only gets even worse and even darker than that. Some skeptics have pointed out additional problems with the story. For example, a tenant living in an apartment upstairs never saw or heard any of the supposed paranormal happenings in the house. And others have pointed out that all of the paranormal happenings only started showing up when the family fell behind on the rent and were facing eviction. That seems like a pretty common motive to invent a ghost story. But it gets even worse and even darker than that. Cancer wasn't the only problem Philip had. There's even some question regarding whether he had cancer at all, though I'm not necessarily going to question that part. But we do know that he got caught. How do I put this? He got caught doing things he oughtn't with the young nieces staying in the house. He admitted as much to the authorities and was hospitalized for a time with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. At one point, when Ray was interviewing the boy about the ghost stories, Philip even admitted all the ghosts went away when he took his medication. Apparently, his mother quickly ended that phone call. As for the book itself, Ray continued writing it because he wasn't able to get out of his contract. However, he did manage to exercise some degree of control over its publication. If you look closely at my copy here, you'll note that at the top it says, "The accounts of the demonologists featured in the film The Conjuring." Now, if you look at other books in this series, that line at the top says, "The true accounts of the demonologists featured in the film The Conjuring." Ray wouldn't have any of that, and he was able to ensure the publisher removed all references to the story being true from his book, because he knew, better than most, just how untrue it really was. And then there was the Smurl case. This is the one that served as the basis for the new Conjuring Last Rites movie, which is either soon to be out or was just released, depending on when this video actually airs. Because the movie is so new, as of this filming, I haven't seen it yet, but I will be seeing it soon, and I will be reviewing it on this channel when I do, so stay tuned for that. But just be aware for now that here I'm talking only about the allegedly true case and not about the new Conjuring movie, because I haven't seen it yet. In this one, Jack and Janet Smurl moved into a new house in Pennsylvania in the mid-1970s, and as usual, quickly began experiencing the paranormal. It all started off mildly enough. Tools went missing and reappeared where they oughtn't, that sort of thing. Then they started hearing noises and voices. Appliances caught fire in some cases. Some unseen force threw their dog into a wall. And some evil being even sexually assaulted Janet. This was no mere haunting. The Warrens were called in, and Lorraine's psychic ability identified 4 entities in the house. A harmless old woman, a deceased resident, a possibly violent young girl, and some sort of a demonic entity manipulating or controlling all of the others. Several priests visited the house, one of whom even stayed for 2 nights in 1986, but none of them reported anything unusual. After several blessings, with the priests never finding anything worth reporting, things seemed to mellow a bit, but never to quite go away for the Smurls until they left the house in 1988. The next occupant never reported anything paranormal. And that's kind of where this case ends up. Unlike some of the others, we don't have a real smoking gun where anyone got caught hoaxing everything. But no one other than the Smurls themselves ever saw or heard anything out of the ordinary. And that doesn't include just skeptical researchers. That includes members of clergy who presumably believe in demonic things. Well, except maybe the Warrens. They might also have claimed to have experienced some things, but by now you understand why I don't consider their word very credible. One potential explanation came up when Jack Smurl admitted he'd had surgery to remove fluid from his brain in 1983, which was a complication of a case of meningitis in his youth. Psychologists and skeptics Paul Kurtz and Robert Gordon think this was the most likely explanation. Their story stemmed less from anything demonic than from delusions or hallucinations brought on perhaps by neurological causes. So, again, I can't debunk the story with any direct evidence, but I think we do have a more parsimonious explanation, given that neither the Smurls nor the Warrens were able to produce any real evidence, any video recordings or any physical evidence for their claims. Finally, the last of the cases we'll look at, however briefly, is Ed Warren's Lady in White video. In this video, recorded I believe in 1990, he claimed to have captured a ghostly lady in white, a common sort of a ghostly manifestation, and she was wandering among the headstones in Union Cemetery in Easton, Connecticut. I've seen that video, and frankly, I'm not all that impressed. I'll put just a little clip of it on the screen so you can see what I'm talking about here. In the video, you can clearly see a figure in a whitish color, or at least a light color, walking through the cemetery. But the quality of the video is just so bad, either because the original quality was that bad or because it's been so degraded over the years, that I really don't know what I'm looking at. It could be a ghost for all I know, but also for all I know it could be Bigfoot or anything else. Well, that would be the case if the figure hadn't actually come forward and publicly admitted her role in the process in a sworn statement. Judith Penney said Ed Warren convinced her to put on a white sheet and walk through the cemetery in front of his camera in the summer of 1990. So that's another case closed. But wait a minute. Who is Judith Penney? That's a name we haven't encountered yet. And this is the point at which the story of the Warrens turns a lot darker. If Judith Penney's account is to be believed, they were not the kindly souls fighting the forces of evil as depicted in the movies. No, according to Penney, Ed Warren had plenty of demons of his own. You see, according to the same sworn statement by Penney herself, she had a 40-year-long sexual affair with Ed, which began when she was only 15 years old and he was 27. Worse, if anything could make accusations of such long-term grooming worse, this all took place inside the Warrens' home, where Ed provided her an apartment, and with Lorraine's full knowledge and apparently support and cooperation. Perhaps even worse still, for those of you who share the Catholic faith the Warrens professed, when Penney got pregnant, Lauren convinced her to abort because the scandal would damage their business and their reputation. Penney also said Ed was abusive toward Lorraine herself, sometimes beating her severely. Now, of course, that's just an accusation. It's from the victim herself, or at least one of the victims, but it is still just an accusation. The Warrens' daughter and son-in-law have denied the whole thing and said they never saw any of these kinds of behaviors. But quite curiously, when the Conjuring films were about to be made, Lorraine, or her lawyers, inserted a rather unusual anti-disparagement clause into the contract that would prevent the filmmakers specifically from depicting Ed or Lorraine as having any extramarital affairs or engaging in crimes, including those of a sexual nature and including those involving underage persons. This is a rather unusually specific anti-disparagement clause, and while it doesn't prove anything conclusively, it does sort of leave a foul stench, especially in light of Penney's sworn accusations. For the film studio's part in all of this, there was discussion, I've heard, in 2015 to pay Penney some $150,000 or so for the rights to her life story and a confidentiality agreement, presumably out of fear that her accusations could derail a major film property, but apparently the deal never actually happened. Although Penney hasn't gone on a press tour or anything either. She just gave her statement and now seems to just want to forget the whole thing, or that's at least the way it seems to me. What about some of the specific claims the Warrens made about their work more generally? Well, for one thing, they claimed a certain degree of expertise I don't think they ever possessed. For his part, Ed Warren claimed to be the only layman, or the only non-ordained person, recognized as a demonologist by the Catholic Church. That's untrue for several reasons. First of all, the Catholic Church does not formally recognize demonologists as a formal title. Exorcists and demonologists are not the same thing. As for exorcists, He could not have been recognized by the church because the Roman ritual for exorcism and the Code of Canon Law both explicitly prohibit non-priests from ever performing a solemn exorcism. Laymen can pray deliverance prayers, you can have holy water and these kinds of things, but a solemn exorcism is reserved specifically for priests and only with the permission of the local ordinary or bishop. But the title of demonologist is informal, and it just refers to one who studies demons. In that sense, if his research were sound, and I don't think it was, the title might apply. We could consider Ed Warren a demonologist in that sense, but it wouldn't be by any sort of formal recognition from the church. Furthermore, though the Warrens regularly collaborated with priests and other clergy in procuring blessings and sometimes even exorcisms for their clients, there's no documentation of any sort to suggest they ever had any kind of a formal relationship with the church other than being practicing Catholics themselves and being interested parties who sometimes called clergy on behalf of a client. Some of the movies do depict Ed Warren performing actual exorcisms himself. That is clearly false, but that's also just a Hollywood embellishment. He never, as far as I know, actually tried to perform one on his own in real life. As for Lorraine, she claimed to be a psychic or a clairvoyant, and that's harder to directly debunk except to say there's really no good evidence for it. Neither of them had any particular schooling through the church or university or anywhere that would qualify them uniquely as paranormal researchers. They were no more or less qualified than, random Joe Blow down the street. They got their start when Ed was a struggling artist. What they would do is they would drive to supposedly haunted or just spooky looking places. Ed would paint the house, and then they would approach the homeowners to try to sell the painting and eventually to try to offer their services as paranormal investigators. It seems to me that most likely Ed convinced Lorraine she was psychic as part of his manipulations to build his paranormal career when painting never really took off for him. What about their claim to have investigated more than 10,000 cases? Well, let's start by doing some basic arithmetic. They founded their New England Society for Psychic Research in 1952. Though they were obviously interested in paranormal claims before that time, otherwise why would they have founded a society? But we'll take that time as the beginning of their formal career as demonologists, ghost hunters, or paranormal investigators, or whatever you want to call them. And though the 1970s through the 1990s seemed to be their most active years, we'll just assume for the sake of this argument that they kept busy until Ed's death on August 23, 2006. Because I don't know exactly when in 1952 they started their society, we'll assume they had it for the whole year, and then we'll also maybe even add a little bit of extra time on for whatever they did before formally starting their society. If we add up all of those days and accounting for leap years between 1952 and 2006, that comes out to just shy of 20,000 days. Therefore, to have accomplished 10,000 cases, they would have had to work a case every 2 days for their entire lives without ever taking a day off. This is just not feasible. Y'all know I've done some work with the Rocky Mountain Paranormal Research Society, and so I have some insight into how long these cases go and how this is done. Even if a case involves just 1 or 2 days of on-site work, most of them involve at least a few weeks of research. Some of these have even taken decades, though admittedly not full-time for the entire duration. We've been at this work for almost 30 years now, and we have, depending on which ones you choose to count as a case, we have maybe 150 cases, maybe 200 or so under our belts. There's just no way any couple could have done more than 10,000 cases if it took us almost 30 years to do 1 to 200. Even if we assume some of the cases were just in and out cases, as we do now know some of them to have been, they must have exaggerated their numbers. On the other hand, if one wants to take them at their word that they were simply the hardest working people you've ever heard of in the entire history of the world, that might make their output seem even worse. If they really did work on so many cases, how could they never produce any evidence that looked more convincing than what they came up with? Our own cases at Rocky Mountain Paranormal are approached with more skepticism than the Warrens' cases. And we've done fewer cases than the Warrens did. And even we have produced better and more credible evidence of the paranormal in some of these cases, where we did find something weird that we just couldn't explain yet. We might not jump to the conclusion that it's a ghost or a demon or something, but that our videos and our audio recordings are more convincing than anything the Warrens ever came up with after all their years, all their fame, and with all their resources. That is quite telling indeed. So, at the end of the day, what are we to make of all of this? I'm certainly not saying there's no such thing as ghosts or demons. I believe in approaching these questions with open-minded but skeptical analysis. I'm also not saying you shouldn't enjoy the Conjuring movies or the Amityville Horror or any of these stories. I certainly do. But I am saying you shouldn't treat those movies or those books as representative of who the Warrens really were, because they simply weren't. For me, I ended up with something of a love-hate relationship with the films. They're great movies, for the most part, but they also remind me of some really dark things about the Warrens, and it makes me uncomfortable sometimes when I'm watching them. I suppose the best thing I can do is to just enjoy the movies as pure fiction. Their portrayal of the Warrens is so far from the reality that, frankly, that's really all they are anyway. With that, it is, alas, time for me to sign off. Do be sure to stay tuned for the rest of my videos about, as I say, anything and everything to do with horror. I've already filmed my September book review video in which I talk about everything I read in August of 2025, so that's coming soon. I filmed it in advance, but I filmed it actually at the same time as I'm doing this one, and I'm pushing this one out first. So, coming soon. Also coming soon will be my review of the new Conjuring movie once I get a chance to see it this coming weekend. And then, of course, I have my own book, the third volume of this Rocky Mountain Paranormal Case Files series. So that's coming out soon, so I'll be making another video shortly to tell you all about that one. So, subscribe, ring the bell, stay tuned, all exciting things. But until then, take care and stay scared.